Playwright markets itself as reliable end-to-end testing for modern web apps. It's maintained by Microsoft and has doubled its NPM installs in the last year, showing steady growth. Personally, one of the things I like most about Playwright is the simplicity of their API. It feels like the API I want to use when writing an end-to-end test, with very little domain-specific language or patterns that get in the way. Since this is a Playwright crash course, we'll be going through setting up your workspace to use Playwright for end-to-end tests, a quick exploration of the Playwright API, including writing tests and utilities, and an explanation of the additional tooling supported by Playwright. For our crash course, we'll use our NX pokedex example that we've shown in our last few videos. If you're not familiar with NX is a mono repo tool we build here at Narwhal, and it's a particularly great way to build full stack TypeScript apps, where your front end and back end code are co-located in the same repository. Because we're using NX, our installation is going to be just a bit different, as we're going to nest our Playwright tests and utilities and configurations inside of an end-to-end project of our NX workspace. If you're not using NX, you can of course follow the same getting started guides we'll look at, but you won't need to make as many steps as I'll make here. So we'll start by clicking on Playwright's Getting Started link, and we'll see that our first step is to run npm init. Now, since we're using NX, we're going to start by cding into our app/pokedex-e2e directory. Now, if we'll open up our file explorer here, we'll see that our pokedex-e2e project is already here inside of our repository. This is because when we created our Pokedex React application, NX also created this E2E application as well. As we can see from what was generated in here initially, NX initially configured this to run end-to-end tests with Cypress. So there's some Cypress stuff in here already. So I'll start by removing the fixtures and the support directories here inside of source, because these contain Cypress specific stuff. And then inside of E2E, I'm going to remove this app.sci.ts file as well. So we'll move those into the trash. And then we can get rid of Cypress config.ts as well. There's some other Cypress residue still in our ESLint and tsconfig, and of course in the root package.json file, but for now I'll skip those for the video. So now remember, we're inside apps/pokedex-e2e with our terminal, and we are going to run npm init playwright at latest. And it'll ask us where to put our tests. Opening up the file directory real quick. We want it to be right here inside of source/e2e. So we'll say source/e2e. It's going to ask us about GitHub Actions. We'll say no for now. But please be sure to comment below if you want to see Playwright with NX and NX Cloud and CI, because I think that would make a great video. So now that it's finished, Playwright created some extra files and we're going to move them around a bit. So first off, we're going to delete the node modules directory here. And this is because we're using NX, so we want to keep all our installed dependencies in our root node modules directory, as well as all of our dependencies listed in our root package.json. So accordingly, we're also going to check the package.json here. I'm actually going to grab this dev dependency real quick, and we're going to drop that into our root package.json file in the dev dependencies here. So I believe alphabetically it goes right here. And now we can get rid of our package.json file and our packagelock.json file, because we only want one of these as well. Boom. So git ignore, I'm going to grab these as well. We'll jump into our git ignore. Let's add a section to our root git ignore. Just call it Playwright. We'll paste these in. We don't care about that one, and we'll just add some stars here. So it'll recursively git ignore all of these. Once that's done, we'll remove the git ignore, delete here, and I'm going to run an npm install at the root of our project again to make sure that our new dependency on Playwright test is installed inside of our root node modules. All right, last step. Playwright also added this demo to do app spec file to give us some insight as to how we can write our tests. You can check this out if you want. I'm just going to delete that for now because we won't need it. It also created this example.spec file inside of the directory we gave it, source/ete. We're going to keep that for now because we're going to try running it. So our next step, according to the docs, is to run npx playwright test. So I'm going to cut that away, and we're going to cd into apps/pokedex-e2e, and we'll run that command npx playwright test. So this is running that test generated in the example spec file we see here. Perfect. And you'll see as a result, it says we're running 3 tests using 3 workers. Interesting because there's only 1 test here. We'll see why that is in just a second. And it tells us to see a report. We can run npx playwright show report. So I'm going to copy and paste that here. And Playwright created a web server for us real quick to show us a report on what all happened here. And we can see actually the same test that we see here inside of our spec file was run 3 times. And we see it's run 3 times because it was run with 3 different browsers. If we go inside of our Playwright config file, we can see, if we scroll down a bit, there's a projects config here inside of the config ts file that is listing Chromium, Firefox, and WebKit as the 3 browsers we wanted to run our tests against. Which if we go to Playwright's homepage here, we can see their mantra, any browser, any platform, one API. It shows all the logos of some of their supported browsers here. So it's cool to see that because that's one of the main things about Playwright, which is there's a heavy emphasis on this sort of testing matrix of browsers against your tests. So by default, it's going to run each one of your tests against each one of the browsers given to it here in this Playwright config. And if we scroll down a little bit here, we can see there's even more that are commented out, and we could uncomment these and figure out how to install them if we want to run it against these additional browsers as well. So now we've got our Playwright commands working, but if I were to open a new terminal now at the root of our project, and I run npx playwright test, I hit that, and I'm going to get a weird error here. And this is because we installed Playwright specifically nested inside of our end-to-end NX application. Remember, that's here inside of pokedex-ete. So running the base commands at the root won't work. And to fix this, we're going to adjust the end-to-end target in our project's JSON file for the end-to-end project. So going into the pokedex-ete inside of this project JSON file, this is where the project-specific NX configurations are included. And the one we're interested in right now is this end-to-end target. So I'm going to get rid of most of this stuff because this is still tied to our old Cypress that was initially created. So I'm going to change the executor away from Cypress to Narwhal workspace run commands. So this is the executor that you use with NX to just run a command as you would inside of a CLI. Inside of the options here, we're going to give it the commands. And here we're just going to write a playwright test. So remember, this is the command that we had run by ourselves inside of the directory for the end-to-end project. And IntelliSense, or Copilot rather, was able to tell where we wanted to run it from the CWD, that's command working directory of app/pokedex-ete. So by setting up our options this way, we're telling NX to run the command playwright test from this command directory. Cool. So once we hit save here, going back to our terminal, I'll be able to run npx nx e2e pokedex-ete. Let's see if that works. Cool. So we see that ran with our 3 browsers. Interestingly, we get even more output here, which is helpful actually. And then we're going to want to do a same thing for the show report command. So we're going to grab the same target for end to end. We'll just paste that in there. And we're going to call this one show report. Same executor, same command working directory, just the command we're going to change slightly to be show report. Hit save there. And if I run npx nx show report pokedex e2e, oh, well, that failed because we're still running the web server. Let's cancel that web server, run it again here. Perfect. So we can see running as expected. Now, if we're using VsCode like I am here, and you also have our NX console extension installed, that's this one over here on the side panel. We'll click into it. You can see that we have a nice UI here to be able to run via project or via target, any of these commands here. So we can also click on this play button here by E2E, and that's going to use NX console to run this command via the GUI as opposed to via the CLI. So it's a good option if you prefer a GUI interface. And we'll see show report is here too, so we can click on that. And it's going to fail again because the web server is still running. Let's try it again. It should start a new web server. Yeah, there's our new result there. So I'm going to include one last step in the installation step here, and that is including a web server for our Playwright config. So if I go to our Playwright config file that was generated when we ran npm init, you'll see commented out is this web server property. I'll go ahead and comment that out. We can see it supports a command that you can run. So this is a command that will be run whenever we start Playwright to start up our web server. Normally you'd run it with like npm run start if you were doing something without nx, but we're going to use npx nx serve pokedex, and we'll give it specifically the port of 9999, and we'll adjust that here too. So the reason we do this is so that in case we are serving our Pokedex application on some other port, our default port, we want to be able to run this end-to-end test without that port clashing when we start up Playwright. So that's why we added the port option here. So this is using the NX serve target, which is using Narwhal React's web server, or I believe it's actually Narwhal Web's web server to start that up, which has the port here as an option that we can use to modify that serve. So we can adjust it here at the command line level. We have to adjust the port here too, because this is actually the port that we provide to Playwright to let it know this command is ready when this port is active. So Playwright's going to be listening for port 9999 to be active, and that's when it's going to say, okay, we can go ahead and start running our test suite now because I can see that the web server has started. So we'll hit save there. And now if we were to run our ETE test, there will be an extra step. We can't really see it here, but behind the scenes, Playwright is starting up a web server on port 9999. Oh, so we can actually see it there in the log. And then it's going to go run our tests. Again, the tests are still just the example, so we're not really using that port yet, but we will in our next section as we start writing our tests. So next up, let's go to Playwright's API docs quick, because I want to show how Playwright separates their API into a Playwright library and a Playwright test API. I like the way that they separated things because it breaks down Playwright into this library API, which we can think of as an automation API for essentially writing robots to automate traversing a browser. If we look at these snippets provided, we can see there's a hierarchy here in the library API where we can see we have a browser object, and that one browser object can have many contexts. We actually can't see this here, but if we go down to, right here, this snippet, we can see one browser can create many contexts. It does have a default context with it. And then from that one context, we can have many pages. So you can see here the API to create a page from a context. So this is actually a really powerful tool for automation, as we can think of these page objects as like a browser tab. So we can exercise interesting test cases using this library where maybe multiple tests are open at a time. And then looking at the snippet, we can see that context can be used to test different devices. Like here, we're testing an iPhone. But contexts are also very useful for running multiple users with their own local storage and login sessions. So if we were to test multiple users or different kinds of users interacting with our system at the same time, this is actually a really great way to do so. So I'm showing on screen here, this is a screen recording from a side project of mine where I wrote a test to automate 25 users in order to stress test a real-time system I was working on for one of my side projects. So each one of the arrows you see on screen here was actually being controlled by Playwright as its own user, and each arrow here has their own browser context. So this is a great unique feature that really helps Playwright stand out, I think. Next up, we have the test API, and we can see that when we write a test, we import test and expect from Playwright test. And this is so that we can use that Playwright test API to write a test suite for our application and make assertions or expectations using that Playwright library. As you can see here, the page object is being destructured out of the argument of our testing callback. So if you're not familiar with destructuring, the idea is that this is syntax sugar for pulling a property out of an object. So if I copy and paste this code from the snippet here into our spec file, let me clearing up the page a little bit. I'm just going to dump that in here to our example spec that we were using before. So the argument of this test callback is actually a context object that has a page property in it. So this, if we were to change this around, so this is essentially the same as that original snippet, just without destructuring as sugar to get rid of this line 4. And we can snoop around here a little bit using IntelliSense on this context object to see what the Playwright test API is doing behind the scenes is actually creating a default browser. So you can see we have access to the browser here and a default context. So you can see the context can be just structured out here as well. And it's kind of confusing because I call it a context, but this would be like the browser context, whereas the context that we have here on line 4, this is actually the Playwright context. And then if we scroll down here, we can see that page object again. So there's a lot more pieces of the API. We won't be able to get to all of it in this crash course, but I think the biggest piece to take away is sort of that browser to context to page hierarchy. And we can see that kind of play out here. So let's fix that back here. So again, looking at the page object, so this page object is coming from the Playwright library API. We can see it's actually passed in via the Playwright test context as an argument. So we don't actually import anything directly from the Playwright library. Instead, the Playwright test library wraps that up for us via this test context argument. And we can then go right into our automation scripting. So here we are going to the playwright.dev URL, and then we're using that page object to get the inner text of the selector, navbar underscore title. We're actually going to use locators, which is another part of the API when we write our actual test. And then we can see this expect is imported from the Playwright test library. And this is how we can write an assertion to make sure that the navbar title's inner text is Playwright, which is what we expect it to be. So we want to assert that's the case or else fail the test so we can know that something went wrong. So for my next step, I'm going to create a test utils ts file inside of my source/e2e directory. And this is because we're going to write some reusable test initialization. So for our pokedex example, recall as part of our Playwright config here, we are already starting up our web server for the front end application. So just by running Playwright, Playwright's going to handle running this command to serve our pokedex. So serve up the web server to host the front end and set the port, but we are actually not sure if the backend will be set up. In our Pokedex example, we're using Supabase to create a Postgres instance and then also create an API to get data from that Postgres instance. That API is going to serve as the data source that our front end is making requests to. So if that API isn't there, our front end's not going to work and we're not going to be able to run our tests. So what we're doing by creating test initialization is we're going to make sure that our Supabase instance is started and is working before we start to try to run our tests. And the reason we want to make it reusable is for our specific example right now, we're going to put everything in one file, but it's very often the case that we actually have several spec files for different domains of tests that we want to create. And it would be nice to have some easy way of sharing test initialization between all those, maybe parameterizing those. We'll talk about what that could look like shortly as well. So I'll go ahead and we'll make our test utils.ts file here. So now keep in mind for your own projects, you may want to do something very similar here, only instead of starting Supabase, maybe you're starting an instance of your own API or seeding your own database. So just substitute your own use case here with us starting Supabase. But for us, since we want to start Supabase, we'll create a function and we'll call it start Supabase. And this will return a new promise. Hey, let's give ourselves some more space, actually. New promise of void, because we don't care what the promise resolves with. We're just looking for the signal that the starting of Supabase is complete. So Copilot is way off base there. But we'll use exec, and this is coming from the child process API from Node. So the way exec works, we're going to pass it a command like we would run on the terminal. So we'll use npx nx. What was the name? This one exactly. It was Pokemon DB start. So we'll say nx start Pokemon DB. So that is the command to run, and then we'll have a callback here. The callback will take an error, I believe, and a standard out, and then a standard error. We actually don't care about standard out or standard error for the quick example I want to show. We just care about the error parameter. So the way exec works, if there was an error, this error will have like an object that is instance of some specific error. I forget at the moment, but we can, if there is no error, that's going to be null. So if there is an error, we're going to assume that Supabase was already running. So we'll say Supabase was already running. Not really an error. We just want to make sure it was running. If it's already running, we'll just get an error from that. And there's other errors that could happen. So this isn't necessarily production ready code, but it's decent example code. So we'll use it. Otherwise, otherwise the fact that this callback is getting called means that the process has completed successfully, in which case we know Supabase has started. So whether we get the error or we don't, we'll kind of give some signal back to ourselves via these console logs, but then we'll resolve our promise that we're returning. So this way we'll call this function. We'll know that Supabase is started and is running once the promise that this function returns resolves. So we don't need to export that function, but we do need to create now another function that we do want to export, and we'll call this one init test. So we'll export our function here, init tests, boom, like so. So what we'll do here is inside of this init test, we're going to import test from Playwright. I'm going to go ahead and do that manually. Import test from @Playwright test. And on this test object, so this, we could use test to just call a test the way we would with like Jest or Jasmine using like it. It's an alias for that. But there's also on this test object our hooks, so our testing hooks. So this is like before all, there's before each. So before all is going to run before all of the test hooks. Before each is going to run before each one. So before all kind of happens once, before each happens before each. And then there's also test after after each and after all as well. So for Supabase, it's the case that we want to start it up once for all of our tests. So we'll say before, we want to call our start Supabase function inside of our before all. So we'll pass it this async anonymous function, and we'll say await start Supabase, like that. And then the way this will work, let's jump back to our example spec file. So here we have our basic tests. So I'm going to make a describe hook here. So this way we'll say our tests. The describe hook is kind of a way of grouping your tests together topically. So within here, we're going to have this test hook. Parens are hard. There we go. So within this describe hook, we can now call init tests, like so. And so what that's going to do is inside of this describe hook, we're going to call our function that we just exported, and we're going to see that it's going to register this before all hook inside of this describe, which is what we want here. So normally the way our tests work, we're going to have a describe at the top of our file. That's kind of like domain this test. And inside of that domain, we want to say before everything happens there, make sure Supabase is running. If we wanted to do something here, so another common thing would be to seed our database, for example. So we'll just call a function seeddb. We won't actually implement it here, but just imagine it's there. If we wanted to do a hook to make sure before each test runs, we seed our database, we're going to call before each. And here we would just await seeddb, like so. So this way we could add, if we wanted to, we could just add another before each hook. In this way, when we call init tests, in addition to starting Supabase before all the tests run, if we had like another test here, say test, second test, async, just pass do nothing there, right? So this way, but just by passing in a init test here, it could kind of set this all up. You can imagine if we had other spec files here, a init test is going to handle setting everything up for those tests as well in a uniform way. If we also wanted to do something where sometimes we had to set seed our DB, but other times not, we could do something where we parameterize this init test as well. So for example, if we wanted to pass a parameter like seed between each test equals false. So let's say, so this would be false by default. We'd say if seed between each test, then await the CDB. So either way, we're attaching the before each hook. But in the case where we don't specifically say we want to seed between each test, we wouldn't actually seed it. So this way we can kind of parameterize our init tests here. So for tests where we would want to seed our DB between each test, we could pass the true here like so. That would make things reseed between each. Otherwise, we just call it like that, and we're not going to seed between each. So that's a great way of unifying test setup and parameterizing it to make it easy for us to kind of write our test initialization once and be able to use it anywhere we want to call it. So before going any further, I also wanted to mention we could always use Playwright's API to mock out network calls that our front end makes. So that way Playwright would actually intercept network calls that our front end made, and we wouldn't actually need to have our pokedex API or our Supabase API running because our Playwright would go in, we'd set up our tests in such a way that Playwright would intercept those network calls and just return mock data in for them. But what we're going for in this example is we're really going full stack, which means we want full end-to-end testing of our system. So we're going to make sure, in our case, that Supabase is actually up and running and we can actually talk to it as part of our ETE test. So this is one of the great things that NX sets us up for. So we want to take full advantage of that. But if you're just interested in Playwright and not NX, and you just want to write end-to-end tests for your front-end application, not necessarily your whole system, just mocking out the network calls with Playwright's API is another alternative you could go for. So now that we have things in place, let's go ahead and write some actual tests for our pokedex, and we'll use this to kind of explore the API just a little bit and hopefully give you some ideas on how this could be helpful. So I'm going to just relabel this describe to be pokedex. So at the top level, we kind of have this describe for the whole system, the whole application. And we'll break this up by our pages because that's kind of how we design things in the initial piece. So we'll say inside of the pokedex, there's a home page. So we'll put our first two tests inside of that home page. And then we'll also have another describe here for, we'll call this just the detail page. And this way, we'll kind of like domain out our tests so we can know specifically like which feature, I guess is the way I'm thinking about this, where home page is one feature, detail page is another feature. So for our first test, we'll say, let's clear out the inside. We'll say, should see 151 Pokemon cards. So the way I kind of like to view testing things end to end is kind of like testing it in a black box, at least from here. Like when we set up things, we kind of have to know what's going on inside the black box a little bit. But in terms of actually writing our tests, the idea would be, like we've talked about in previous videos, if we changed out Supabase for some other API, maybe we're hitting like a Pokemon API directly and don't need Supabase or something like that, shouldn't really affect the actual tests that we're writing here. So I'm going to go ahead and destructure our page here again, and we're going to start by having our page go to, so we'll say HTTP localhost, this is going to be 9999 because that's where we set it up. And that'll get us to our home page. We're going to await this. So this way, a lot of the Playwright APIs works really, really well with sort of this async await syntax. So what this is saying is we're going to sort of, the way I like to think of it is stalling until this go to promise resolves. So as soon as we call it, we're going to start our browser trying to load this URL, but the promise itself will not resolve until we're actually there. So that's what we're waiting for, is waiting for that signal coming from the Playwright API to let us know our browser has successfully landed here on localhost 9999. So now we're going to use what's called a locator. So I'm going to call this the Pokemon card locator. And we're going to say this is equal to page.locator. So locator is like a method that will create a locator object for us. If we look at the IntelliSense here, right? So you see it takes a selector, which is a string. So a selector here is just a CSS selector. So the way we wrote our front end, I believe we just added this class to it real quick. Let's take a look. If we go to home TSX, so there's a basic Pokemon card. Yeah, so inside of our actual implementation, we called it Pokemon card. Here, we're just going to say, look for anything that matches that Pokemon card locator. Let's give ourselves some more space here too. Right, so this will return a locator object, and we can actually run an expect on here. So we'll say await expect Pokemon card locator dot to have count 151. GitHub Copilot was right on base with that one. So this one will make sure that we have 151 cards on our homepage. We want to make sure that's true, because if there aren't, maybe something happened with our database or something like that. Something went wrong, and we want to know that there's a failure before we actually release this. So that's maybe a good first test. Let's make a second test. That's we'll call it clicking a card should link to the detail page. Right. So in this one, we'll start with the same thing. Go to the home page. Oh, let's make sure we just structure out our page object here. And then we'll say constant, and here we'll say Charizard locator equals page.locator. So we'll just use the Pokemon card here as a CSS selector, but we'll also put in an option here to the locator creator called has text. So we're going to say has text Charizard. So this will kind of give us, the way I like to think of it is giving us all the cards here that match the selector, but then we're going to filter it further to elements that have the text somewhere in there called Charizard. So this should be the only one. That's why we'll know this is our Charizard card. Here we have. And so now we will await Charizard locator.click. So this, again, by calling this, Playwright's going to initialize the clicking, and we're going to wait until after the click event has been fired to proceed. And now we are going to await page.wait for URL. There we go. And we're going to wait until the URL matches what we expect it to be. Right. So the way this works, by default, I believe inside of our Playwright config, we've got, this expect timeout. So on our calls here, we're going to have a default timeout of 5 seconds. And if the way this will work, again, as soon as we call this, we're going to start around waiting for the URL to match what we have here. If we hit the timeout and it still doesn't match, we're going to fail the test. So this is kind of sufficient to making sure we got to where we wanted to go. If there was something here, though, where we wanted to set a larger timeout or a shorter timeout maybe even, we could do so by passing a timeout option as our second parameter here. Let's go into the detail page here. We'll write one more test. And this one will go right to Charizard's page. So we'll say test. We'll just say Charizard should have the move growl. So if you were watching our previous videos, you'll know that inside the detail page we also include a table of moves. So we'll just have that here. GitHub Copilot is surprisingly intuitive there. I guess it was able to tell that the URL for Charizard from the previous test, but that's kind of impressive. But we'll do exactly what Copilot recommended. We'll wait going directly to Charizard's page, and then we're going to create a move locator. Let's call this growl move locator. So this way we're telling Playwright to find some element that matches this, and we're going to expect that it exists, essentially, that it has a count of 1. And if it does, we'll go ahead and pass our test. All right, so now's the moment of truth. We've written our tests, now we're going to see if they work. So to do that, remember we already have our NX tooling all set up. So we have this nice E2E button. I'm just going to hit the play there and we'll see how this works out. So 9 tests, that's our 3 tests times our 3 browsers. You can see there's our initialization for Supabase. You can see it was already running in almost all the cases. And we see a failure here. It looks like the Charizard should have the move growl test was failing. So I'm going to, it also opened on my other screen over here. Created this report that showed our timings and what's succeeded and what's failed. So it looks like Charizard is failing on growl across the board. So because we want to focus on this test, we're going to call test dot, I think it's, is it only? Yeah. So by adding the only, we should see only that test run, see 3 tests using 3 runners as opposed to 9 using 9. We should see the same result here. Yeah, same results popped up this over here. So we just see our 3 failing tests. And if we want to see some of the details on here to try to figure out what went wrong, we can see that it expected 1, but received undefined. So there's something probably wrong with our locator here, but we can't really figure it out here just because we don't have context to the browser. So let's fix that. So I'll close this out and we'll go to our pokedex E2E, our pokedex E2E project JSON file. I'm going to copy the end-to-end target and we're going to make a debug target. So end-to-end is running our tests in a headless mode. We want our tests run in a headed mode so we can kind of debug what's going on here. So we're going to actually use the same Playwright test here, but we're going to set the environment variable pwdebug, so that stands for Playwright debug equals 1. So what this is doing is turning debug mode on for Playwright. So we'll be able to see, we can step through our tests and see what's going on in a browser. I'm also going to go ahead and add some other parameters to the command here. I'm looking at the command line interactions, or the command line options here in my other window here. So you can see we'll set timeout to 0, I think, and we'll just set one project so that we only run, when we're in debug, we'll only run in Chromium because that's the dev tools I tend to like the most. So we'll say -x project equals Chromium. And I'm going to say --timeout equals 0. We want to set that to 0 so there is no timeout because I think by default there's a 30-second timeout on our tests. And we don't want to hit that because we're debugging stuff. So I'll hit save. And that should populate the debug target here in NX console. We'll click it. So we can see here on the right hand side is this Playwright inspector. So that's just a kind of copy and paste of our source code. And it's kind of like breakpoints, how we'll move through it. It's not actually breakpoints because I actually can't set them, but we can like step from Playwright command to Playwright command. So right now we're kind of waiting for the page go to command to run. So I'll hit that. Then we skipped over the locator command because that's not actually doing anything with the API. It's just creating a reference to our locator. And then we're waiting now for our move locator to have a count of 1. So we want to figure out what's going on because there's growl right there. And if we inspect this, we can kind of open up the dev tools like we normally would, figure out what's going on. So looking at the selector, we expect this element or its parent. So we can see here its parent has the class of move. So that looks right. But if we look at this, I don't think has text is case sensitive, but if you'll notice here, that's a 1 instead of an L. So we can kind of figure out using this tool what was going on here. So I'm going to copy this right out of here and we'll go to our example spec. We'll just fix that has text selector. I'll hit a save there. We'll go ahead and kill off our running executors so we can just hit the end-to-end here again. And we can see that passed right away. So perfect. That must have been the issue. So just to make sure, I'm actually going to mangle this again just to make sure we can fail it now. In general, this is a practice I like to use just to make sure the test is actually working and not giving us a false positive. So we mangle it, it fails. We fix it and save it. We should see it pass. Perfect. So I'm going to remove the only here. And just for good measure, we'll do that over here too. So I'll mangle the URL here real quick. And let's run it. Okay, so that one failed. And then we'll fix that and run it, and it should now be passing. Cool. And last one, we'll just mangle this a little bit. Hit the end-to-end. Failing, and fix it. And passing again. Perfect. So our test suite is set up, and yeah, Everything looks great for our pokedex. Looks like we are set for now. So one last thing I wanted to show before we wrap up the video was the Playwright extension. So I actually have this installed normally, but I had it disabled for most of this video because I wanted to save it till the end. So if I go ahead and enable this here, so by turning it on, we gained access to this testing tab here on VsCode. And we can see this is actually the structure of our combination of our file directory structure and our describes. So we can see example spec up to here's all file directory structure, and then here are the describes we have inside of that example spec. So I'm going to click here to run all the tests, and we can see this is going to go off and queue off all of our tests and run them here. So this is like a really nice UI way of running these tests, and it works reasonably well with NX. So you can see like it's able to figure out, even though this is nested deeply inside of our workspace, it's able to find the right Playwright config for these files. If we want to see the terminal output for these, we can see them here. There's some interesting pieces of this. For example, I believe it only is running it, as we can see, with the one project with Chromium. I'm not sure why that is, but there may be a way of configuring that elsewhere. Also, if we click into the example spec file here, we can see on the side in this next to the line numbers, there's these checkbox or these check marks. We can click them, and that's going to actually just focus this one test and run it individually, which is a great way of isolating those tests, as we saw. So the debug here, you'll see if I right click on this check mark and click debug test, the debug mode is actually not quite what we wanted. That's why I created the debug NX task, because this is going to run things headed, but it's not going to give us the ability to step through the tests for some reason. And it's a similar thing if we go here. Running in debug mode via the extension doesn't quite do what we would hope it would. But that's okay because we have the debug executor to do what we want, and we can kind of combine that with only. But I did want to highlight this as a way of showing off some of the more tools you can use with Playwright, which is great because Playwright doesn't currently have a watch mode. So in the absence of a watch mode, this extension helps a decent amount. Using test.onlys can help you kind of get that focused as well. So you can kind of use Playwright the way you'd like to. So a lot of tooling around here to make the experience quite good. All right, y'all, that's it for this video. As you can tell, if you've been watching our channel for a bit, we've been experimenting with the format a little bit, so please let us know in the comments if you like this longer format. Please also hit us up with any questions that you have on Playwright or NX. We'll be checking the comments and trying to respond to each one this week. Our next video will also be on Playwright, and in that one, we'll be creating an NX plugin for Playwright inside of our pokedex repository here. And in that video, we'll be automating a lot of the steps that we took here to package them up into nice pre-constructed generators and executors, so it's very easy to share those across our other apps and also with other repositories as well by publishing the plugin. So if it's ready, you can check it here, and we'll see you next time.